"Excuse me. This seat is reserved for VIP guests. Please give it up." The words rang out in the lavish business class cabin of an international flight from New York to Geneva. The previously quiet space filled with elite passengers suddenly grew tense. All eyes turned toward seat 2A, where a black man sat upright, dressed in a crisp suit, staring calmly at the flight attendant in front of him. His name was Ethan Cole, and that was the seat he had reserved and paid for in full, using his titanium elite card, the highest-tier membership offered by Regal Air. Standing before him was the head flight attendant, Olivia, her voice polite but unmistakably assertive. "We need you to switch seats to accommodate a special passenger, Ms. Sophia Hargrove. She always sits in this seat, on this route." Behind Olivia stood a white woman in a Chanel dress, arms crossed, her expression filled with irritation. She didn't speak loudly, but loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. "I always sit in 2A. It's practically my seat." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, keeping his voice calm. "I'm sorry, but this is the seat I reserved. I'm a titanium elite member with Regal Air. Here is my card." He held out the sleek silver card. Olivia glanced at it, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. But her voice remained firm. "I understand, but perhaps you're unaware this seat is typically prioritized for longtime customers like Ms. Sophia. We'd appreciate your cooperation for the sake of overall convenience." A wave of murmuring began to ripple through the business class rows. A few passengers started checking their phones. One quietly lifted theirs to record the scene. Ethan remained composed, though his eyes revealed a familiar sense of disappointment. He'd seen this far too many times. To others, this might be a minor misunderstanding. But to him, a black man in a suit sitting in business class, that suspicious gaze had followed him all his life. What Olivia didn't know, and neither did Sophia, was that the man they were asking to move was none other than Ethan Cole, CEO and founder of Equinox Intelligence, a tech company valued at $2.8 billion. His company was Regal Air's top prospective partner in a $50 million strategic deal, one that aimed to modernize the airline's entire service system and eliminate unconscious bias from their customer care operations. Ironically, the very system they were seeking to fix, they were now violating. No one realized that the passenger they deemed unworthy was the one person who could determine the future of the airline they served. Ethan adjusted his collar, still not standing up. He looked at Olivia with the calm gaze of a man who had faced far greater battles. In that moment, a passenger behind him quietly started filming the entire scene. The silence stretched, taut like a drawn wire. Somewhere in the cabin, people began to realize something big was about to happen, and this was only the beginning. Bronx, New York, where gray brick buildings crowd together and the sound of car horns never stops, was the place where a young black boy named Ethan Cole grew up. There were no privileges, no shortcuts. Every step forward had to be earned with 10 times the effort. At age 11, while other kids played basketball on the court below, Ethan sat by the window, buried in learning how to code on an old laptop his mother had bought from a second-hand store. That boy wasn't just writing lines of code, he was rewriting his own destiny. Tragedy struck when Ethan was 13. His father, Lewis Cole, a gentleman who always wore a knit cap and taught Ethan to treat people with kindness, was shot and killed in a racially motivated case of mistaken identity, right outside the neighborhood grocery store. The news called it a case of mistaken identity. But Ethan knew a white man wouldn't be shot just for standing in the wrong place. At the funeral, Ethan stood in front of his father's grave and didn't cry. There was only one promise carved deep into his mind. "I'll make the world see people for their actions, not their skin color. From that day on, Ethan studied harder, worked longer, because failure was not an option for him. At 19, he turned down a scholarship from a prestigious university to launch a startup. A cramped rented apartment, a wobbly wooden desk, a bag of instant noodles for every meal. He worked 18 hours a day for 2 years, writing thousands of lines of code to build what the world would later know as Veritas AI, a software powered by artificial intelligence, designed to detect bias and discriminatory behavior in customer service interactions. Veritas wasn't just technology, it was a mission. It was the extended hand of the vow Ethan had made at his father's grave. That day, the day the incident happened on the plane, Ethan was on his way to Switzerland, invited to speak at the Global Tech Ethics Summit, themed AI Ethics and Service Minds in Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Service. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, a silver-gray tie, a smart watch on his wrist, but nothing could conceal the familiar fatigue in his eyes, the kind that returns every time he enters a space where people silently think, someone like him doesn't belong here. He bought a business-class ticket, seat 2A, chosen for its space so he could finalize his keynote presentation during the flight. But instead of receiving the thoughtful service the airline so proudly advertised, Ethan was stopped. Judging eyes, suspicious voices, and a request to give up his seat for a white regular customer, as if he had wandered into a world where he didn't belong. What they didn't know was that the man they were trying to push out of that seat was the CEO of a $2.8 billion tech company, and the very person their airline had been pursuing to help modernize their bias handling systems. A full circle of irony, but also the beginning of a shockwave no one saw coming. "Excuse me, sir, but it seems there's been a slight mix-up with the seating arrangement," a gentle female voice spoke from the front. Chief Flight Attendant Olivia, hair neatly tied up, uniform perfectly pressed, walked toward seat 2A with a polite smile. But in her eyes, there was a cold, suspicious look. "This seat," Olivia continued, "is typically reserved for a special passenger. Miss Sophia travels this route weekly and always sits in 2A. Would you mind switching to another seat in the same class to accommodate her?" Ethan looked up from his open laptop. His gaze was calm, but his voice was steady and firm. "I understand. But this is the seat I reserved. Seat 2A, clearly printed on my ticket and digital confirmation. I'm a Titanium Elite member, and I need this seat to finalize my keynote for the flight." Olivia's lips curled, a polite smile twisted out of shape, then she stepped back. Behind her, Sophia had already appeared at some point. Wavy blonde hair, a cream-colored Chanel dress, high heels tapping rhythmically to some invisible tune in her mind. "I always sit here. Every flight, it's 2A, Sophia declared, as if issuing a command. "I don't like changing seats for anyone, especially when I tip the crew every week." Ethan said nothing. He didn't respond to the arrogance, nor did he bow his head. A few nearby passengers began to take notice. Someone raised their phone and turned on the camera. Olivia flushed slightly, glancing around. But just a second later, thinking the eyes had shifted away, Sophia quietly slipped a small white envelope into Olivia's uniform pocket. "For convenience." "As always," she whispered, her eyes dripping with visible disdain toward Ethan. And that was the moment everything slipped past the line of what they called politeness. Less than 2 minutes later, Lance, the main cabin manager, tall, in a gray suit, arrived. His face was stiff, his eyes far from welcoming. "Sir," Lance began, without even a hint of a smile, "I've been informed there's an issue with the seating. If you refuse to cooperate and switch seats for our priority guest, we'll have to proceed with standard protocol. And I'm sure you wouldn't want that to happen. Everything seemed to unfold like a pre-written script. Ethan remained seated, calm, but his eyes sharp as steel. He looked straight at Lance. What protocol allows an airline to reassign a seat that's been properly confirmed, just because someone else is more familiar to the crew? Lance paused for a beat, then repeated, "We're asking for your cooperation so the flight can proceed smoothly. If you decline, we'll have to escalate this to the captain." A nearby passenger, a middle-aged Asian woman, whispered, "I can clearly see that man's not in the wrong. They're trying to force him." A younger passenger, a few rows behind, openly began recording the scene, typing a caption. "Discrimination on a plane?" The atmosphere in the business class cabin began to thicken. What started as soft-spoken courtesy was now exposed for what truly was: a blatant act of bias, thinly veiled under niceties. Ethan quietly opened his coat pocket, placed his own phone on the tray table, and turned on the camera. No anger, no raised voice. But it was clear he was ready to document everything. The confrontation had only just begun. No one said another word when Lance returned to the business class cabin. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked Captain Harris, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience flying transatlantic routes. But this time, his expression wasn't as composed as it was in the cockpit. His brows were furrowed, his eyes stern as they scanned the cabin, before landing on the black man sitting in seat 2A. "We need to speak with you privately," Lance said, his voice cold as steel. It wasn't a request. It was a command in disguise. Straight at them, Ethan, one hand resting lightly on his briefcase. Captain Harris stepped forward, tension in his gaze. "Sir, can you please cooperate so we can resolve this situation?" "Cole, Ethan Cole," he answered, calm as a frozen lake. Behind them, Olivia's expression flickered with alarm. Perhaps she had just realized the name sounded familiar. But Sophia continued her performance. She started breathing heavily, hand over her chest, as if she had just suffered an emotional breakdown. I feel threatened," she cried, her voice loud like an alarm. "Why won't he give up the seat? This is where I always sit." Lance quickly turned back to Marcus, or rather, now he knew, Ethan, his tone more urgent. "Mr. Cole, if you continue refusing to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to proceed with our security protocol," Lance said. This time, the threat was crystal clear. Ethan slowly opened the flap of his blazer pocket, pulled out his phone, and activated the video recording function. He raised the camera toward the three people standing in front of him and said loudly, clearly, every word deliberate. "I am sitting in the seat I legally purchased. I am a Titanium Elite member, and I'm being asked to leave just because I'm a black man in seat 2A. A wave of silence swept across the first-class cabin. Several passengers raised their cameras. One nodded quietly in agreement. Captain Harris flinched slightly. The air grew thick. "You're recording without permission on a plane. That's a security violation," Lance snapped, his tone slipping out of control. "There is no federal law prohibiting filming as long as it doesn't interfere with the crew," Ethan replied, swiftly and precisely, as if reciting it from a statute. "I'm recording to protect my legal rights." Sophia cut in again, trying to escalate the drama. "He's threatening me with his phone. I'm a woman. I don't feel safe." Ethan turned the camera toward her, eyes steady, unblinking. "So when a white woman feels uncomfortable because a black man is sitting in the seat he paid for, that black man becomes a threat?" Olivia looked uneasy, but Lance remained rigid. Harris turned away, avoiding the growing stares from the other passengers. Finally, the captain spoke, his voice like ice. "This is your final warning. If you do not vacate the seat immediately, we will call airport security and have you removed from the aircraft. You may also be permanently banned from flying with Skylux Airlines." Ethan tightened his grip on the handle of his briefcase. There was no fear in his eyes. Only one thing remained: an unwavering determination not to back down. What no one in that cabin knew was that the reversal of power was about to begin. The air in the business class cabin was frozen still. Firm footsteps echoed from the front of the plane. Two security officers dressed in black uniforms walked directly toward seat 2A, where Ethan Cole, still seated in silence, eyes unwavering, held his phone, recording everything. Lance pointed. "This passenger, please escort him off the plane." Ethan didn't resist. He simply set the recording phone down on the seat, carefully adjusting the angle. Then he stood up, slipped on his blazer, and gathered his briefcase. Every movement calm, deliberate. No shouting, no anger. Passengers held their breath. Some turned their faces away. Others raised their phones to film, not out of curiosity this time, but out of outrage. Sophia slid into seat 2A the moment Ethan stepped away. A triumphant smile stretched across her face. While Olivia looked nervously around, Lance maintained a cold, emotionless expression, following the security officers like a man completing a mission. But in the very moment that seemed to signal resolution, Sophia discreetly pulled a small envelope from her handbag, slipping it into Lance's hand as he leaned near her seat. "Thank you for handling that so efficiently," she whispered. What she didn't realize was that another phone, from the seat behind her, had captured the entire exchange, in perfect view. As Ethan was escorted down the aircraft stairs, the morning sun hit him directly, suit crisp, posture upright. But inside him, a storm was brewing. Just minutes after stepping into the private lounge at the airport, Ethan pulled out his phone and sent a single-line message to his assistant. "Activate full legal team. The game begins." Seconds later, the internal lines of Veritas AI lit up. On the other end, his executive assistant, Maya, practically shot to her feet. "Understood. I'll alert legal, PR, and engineering. We've got a response plan ready." At that very moment, a woman's voice called out behind him. "Mr. Cole, I'm Nora. I was in seat 3B. I recorded everything." From the moment that woman gave the envelope to the attendant, to when they forced you off, I couldn't just sit by and watch that happen. Young woman, late 20s, Ethan turned brown hair in a neat bun, eyes fierce but clearly shaken. In her hand, a phone, with the video already queued up. Just as she said, images, audio, every word, clear as day. "Could you send me the video?" Ethan asked. "Of course, and if you need a witness, I'm willing." He nodded. His face remained expressionless, but in his eyes, a spark lit up. Not just because of the footage, but because of one undeniable truth. This time, he wasn't alone. Above them, the flight continued. Sophia sipped champagne. Olivia forced a tight smile. Lance counted the cash in his blazer pocket, but none of them knew that Nora's video, just a few hours later, would become the center of a social media firestorm, and the name Ethan Cole would no longer remain a secret. Just hours from now, a media hurricane would strike, and it wouldn't just sweep away the three people who removed a man from his rightful seat. It would threaten the entire future of Skylux Airlines. 6 hours after the incident, social media exploded. The hashtags # Ethan Cole, #2AIS, not for black men, and #Orion Airgate spread like wildfire across Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. The video recorded by Nora, the passenger who filmed it all, gained over 2 million views in just that afternoon. Headline after headline dominated news sites. Black CEO kicked out of his paid seat for not looking like VIP. Orion Air, the most expensive discrimination of the year. The man they removed was negotiating a $60 million deal with them. The sleek glass headquarters of Orion Air in Chicago suddenly became a press magnet. Inside the 26th floor, CEO Cliff Bennett slammed a fax onto the table, his face pale as paper. "Who is this man? What's his name?" Cliff barked at the PR department. A trembling employee stepped in, holding a passenger report. "Ethan Cole, CEO of Veritas AI, the man currently negotiating a $60 million contract to upgrade our AI bias mitigation systems for our own airline." The room went silent, frozen. Cliff rushed to turn on the large conference screen. There, in high definition, was Ethan being escorted off the plane. His eyes neither angry nor defeated, just calm, as if he had expected it all along. In the video, it was clear. Sophia handing an envelope to Chief Attendant Olivia, and then to Lance, the cabin manager. The light reflected clearly off the bills inside. Ethan didn't lash out. He simply stood, leaving his recording phone on the seat, as if to leave behind a living piece of evidence. A chill ran down Cliff's spine. His phone rang. The caller, Ethan Cole. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett." Ethan's voice was calm, but there was something icy beneath every word. "I'm calling to inform you that I've officially withdrawn from all partnership negotiations." "Wait, Ethan. This is something we can revisit. Discuss." Cliff stammered, sweat forming on his forehead. "Ah, yes. Almost forgot." Ethan continued, his voice deepening. "I currently hold 28% of Orion Air's shares, and I've just called for an emergency shareholders meeting." The other end of the line went silent. "We'll take immediate action." Cliff panicked. Ethan hung up. Within 30 minutes of the call, Cliff had summoned the entire executive board. Everyone had seen the video. No one was talking about the AI contract anymore. Now the focus was how to save the company from the biggest PR disaster in Orion Air's history. But there was something they still didn't know. Veritas AI, Ethan's company, didn't just supply AI tech. It tracked and analyzed bias-related behavior in customer interactions for over 200 global brands. And now, Orion Air's data was in the hands of the man they had just publicly humiliated. Exactly 6 p.m., Ethan posted a single message on Twitter. "They said I didn't deserve the seat I paid for. I wonder, who truly doesn't deserve the position they're in?" The tweet hit 1.5 million likes in just 2 hours. Inside a sealed conference room on the 42nd floor of Orion Air's headquarters, the air felt suffocating, as if someone had just cut off the oxygen supply. CEO Cliff Bennett sat at the head of the table, his face tense and rigid. In front of him were Olivia, the chief flight attendant, Lance, the business class cabin manager, and Captain Harris, the man usually behind the cockpit, but this time behind the decision to remove a passenger. A massive 16K screen lit up. The video from Nora's account played in full screen. No music, no effects, just the raw, brutal clarity of truth. The room was dead silent as the footage showed Sophia slipping cash into Olivia's hand. Then came the moment Lance nodded at Sophia and whispered into his radio, followed by Captain Harris joining them as they approached Ethan, surrounding him like he was a threat. Every gaze on the plane, every expression from the passengers, all reflected the same thing. Injustice unfolding, being escorted off the aircraft, his phone still recording, his head still held high. Though removed, he never once bowed. Cliff said nothing for 30 seconds after the video stopped. Then he stood, slowly walking toward the glass wall, overlooking the city skyline. The late afternoon sun filtered through the skyscrapers, casting a pale streak of light across the boardroom. "This is no longer an internal matter," Cliff said, his voice hoarse. "This is a global crisis." He turned back, facing the three of them. "Do you even know who Ethan Cole is?" Silence. "He's the CEO of Veritas AI, the man we were negotiating a $60 million contract with, the man who owns 28% of Orion Air." Olivia broke down in tears, her hands trembling. I didn't know. I just thought—" "You thought what?" Cliff cut her off, his eyes sharp as a blade. "That a black man in a suit sitting in business class didn't belong there? You didn't think. You judged." Lance lowered his head, his face ghostly pale. Captain Harris, the man who had once landed planes safely through blizzards and emergencies, now stood still, shoulders slumped. "The three of you," Cliff continued, "didn't just humiliate a man, you brought this entire airline to the brink of collapse." At that moment, the HR director entered the room, carrying 3 large envelopes. "By order of the Board of Shareholders," she stated plainly, "termination is effective immediately. No severance, no letters of appreciation." Olivia sobbed, gripping a chair to keep from collapsing. Lance said nothing, took the envelope, and walked away. Captain Harris, still in his pilot's uniform, once a badge of pride, slowly removed his insignia from his chest and laid it on the table. "I used to think I was a fair man," he said. "But today, I realized I stayed silent when I should have spoken up." As the three exited the boardroom, Ethan entered from the opposite door, flanked by his assistant and legal counsel. No one said a word. Only Ethan's gaze moved, resting briefly on Olivia, still crying, Lance, trembling, and Harris, head bowed. No anger in his eyes, no contempt. Only the silence of a man who had once been humiliated in public, now standing face to face with those experiencing that very same fall. The official statement was released at 8 a.m., directly from CEO Cliff Bennett. Orion Air will suspend all flight operations for the next 72 hours, not due to technical failures, but due to a failure of ethics. We will not launch another flight until every one of our employees learns how to see people beyond the color of their skin. All 27,000 employees of Orion Air were stunned. Flights were delayed. Passengers flooded major airports. The media exploded over what seemed like a shocking decision. Shut down an entire airline over one act of discrimination? But inside Orion's headquarters in Dallas, the plan was already in motion. Ethan Cole, the man who had once been removed from a seat he paid for, was not asking for compensation. He wasn't demanding a public apology. He proposed something else: systemic reform through technology and humanity. "We can't fix what we can't see," Ethan said in a meeting with the executive board. "But my Veritas AI software designed to detect bias and discrimination in service can see it." Within hours, the entire system, passenger interactions, customer feedback, call recordings, and flight attendant behavior data was scanned, and the results were shocking. White customers were addressed by name 92% of the time. For black customers, only 36%. The numbers didn't lie. But what Ethan wanted was for people to understand what they were unconsciously perpetuating every single day. In the large 31st floor boardroom, beneath a stainless steel Orion Air logo, the first training session began. Ethan stood there not as the CEO of a $2.8 billion company, but as someone who had once been treated like he was invisible. "That day, I wore a suit. I had a titanium elite card. I had a first-class ticket. But no one saw me as a customer. They saw my skin first and placed a label on me. Below him, nearly 200 employees, flight attendants, managers, and pilots sat in silence. Some had shown visible discomfort at being forced to relearn. But once the videos began, the clip of Sophia handing over money, the footage of Ethan being escorted off, those expressions disappeared. Rachel, a flight attendant with 17 years of experience, lowered her head and said, "I used to believe I treated everyone fairly, but now I realize." I smiled more at white passengers. Another white captain stood up and admitted, "I've never addressed black passengers as sir. I only realized that today." Ethan didn't lecture. He said just one thing: bias is invisible until someone points it out. And until we have the courage to face it, a flood of internal emails hit HR. "I'd like to move to an earlier training session. Please send me the Veritas AI material on bias analysis. I think I may have done what happened to Ethan. I want to change." 72 hours later, Orion Air was no longer the same airline. It became the first airline in the world to mandate that every employee, from flight attendants and mechanics to senior executives, complete a service ethics retraining program designed by the very person they had once wronged. Because bias doesn't disappear on its own. It disappears when someone is brave enough to stop and look it straight in the eye. "We're sorry, but we will not be proceeding with your interview process." Lance exhaled deeply, closing his laptop softly. It was the 6th rejection email he had received from airlines in just 2 weeks. The response was always the same. He didn't even need to read past the first line. He already knew. His name and his past had become an indelible stain in the aviation industry. Olivia wasn't faring any better. Once a chief flight attendant for 5 years, now she only received callbacks from coffee shops or small delivery companies. But wherever she went, the moment someone recognized her as the woman in the video, the one who helped remove a black passenger from seat 2A, the air would turn painfully silent. Captain Harris was quieter. He no longer hoped to work at any airline, despite 22 spotless years in the sky. Just a few minutes of silent compliance on that flight had sent his career plummeting into free fall. The three of them were no longer aviation professionals. They were now living proof that 1 minute of prejudice can end an entire lifetime of work. Meanwhile, at the Veritas Foundation, a nonprofit recently founded by Ethan Cole, a special program had launched. Its name was Reboot. Its goal was not punishment, but to retrain the mind. "We can't erase prejudice through judgment," Ethan had said at the program's launch. "We can only confront it through education, through truth, and through the courage to change." Reboot lasted 12 weeks. Participants would re-examine everything they once accepted as normal, from identifying unconscious bias to making ethical choices in difficult moments. The course wasn't just theoretical. They were placed in real-life simulations, where even the smallest behavior was examined through the lens of justice. Lance, Olivia, and Harris were the first 3 to enroll, not because they believed they would be forgiven, but because they couldn't keep living as the versions of themselves that had caused harm. In week 3, Lance cried for the first time, watching the footage of himself ordering Ethan's removal. "I saw a man who wasn't out of control, who didn't cause a scene, but I treated him like a threat just because he didn't look like the people who usually sat there." Olivia broke down during an exercise on reading customer emotions. "I was trained to smile professionally, but no one ever taught me how to truly listen to another human being." Captain Harris took longer to open up. But by the final week, he wrote one quiet line on the classroom whiteboard: "I believed in order." But that day, I realized, the order I protected left no room for justice. On reboot graduation day, the three of them stood before a new group of trainees. No one asked them to apologize, but they did through action. Harris bowed his head and passed his old captain's badge to a young trainee of African descent. Lance volunteered to become a mentor for the next cohort. And Olivia, quietly arranging chairs and preparing the room like a true flight attendant, only this time, she began with a gaze that finally knew how to listen. No spotlight, no cameras, only redemption from the heart. Ethan sat at the back of the room, silently watching. He didn't applaud, but in his eyes was something more powerful than praise. Recognition that some wounds can't be healed by punishment, only by transformation. Bias doesn't always scream in your face, said Dr. Marcia Bell, a sociology expert from Columbia University, during a special interview with a national news channel. It can hide in a passing glance, in the way one person is prioritized over another, in a phrase that sounds polite, but is loaded with implication. On screen was the image of Ethan Cole, composed, well-dressed, being escorted off the airplane, for which he had bought a ticket, under the silent gaze of dozens of witnesses. "We need you to give up your seat for a VIP passenger." That seemingly harmless sentence was, in truth, a slap in the face of the system. And Ethan chose not to stay silent. Dr. Marcia continued. For years, customer service systems in airlines, banks, restaurants, even hospitals, have operated under unwritten rules. It's a space where those who look the part are favored, while others must constantly prove their worth. But he's the first with enough power, composure, and evidence to force an entire system to change. After Ethan launched the Veritas protocol, media outlets scrambled to cover the story. But what shocked the public more was Orion Air's response. Not denial, not silence. They acted. Orion Air made a public statement. We're not just apologizing. We're changing. Within just 30 days, the airline rolled out the Colorblind Service Code, a new set of service principles based solely on behavior, not physical appearance. Passengers would be evaluated based on their flight history, feedback, and interaction behavior, not their name, race, or status assigned through unconscious bias. Alongside this, Veritas AI, developed by Ethan, was fully integrated into the airline's customer service systems. Every call, message, or online interaction would now be scanned in real time by the software to detect signs of bias, discrimination, or disrespectful language. Internal trainers were replaced with individuals who had either been victims of bias or had once caused harm, like Lance and Olivia, who had completed the reboot program. They became living proof that change is possible, if people are humble enough to relearn from scratch. Dr. Marcia concluded, "We can't eliminate bias through policies alone, but we can expose it, put it on the table, and force people to look at it." Ethan did exactly that, not by shouting, but by standing up, walking off the plane, and quietly transforming an entire industry's service protocol. Viewers who watched the video left comments. "I've never seen an airline willing to shut down its entire system over one incident." I'm a flight attendant, and after watching this story, I changed how I treat passengers on every flight. If you think one person can't change the world, watch Ethan Cole. At Orion Air headquarters, a new sign was posted near the boarding gates. Passengers will not be judged by the color of their skin, gender, or status. We serve people, not prejudice. And just below it, in small italicized print, what you do when no one is watching. That's what defines who you are. Less than 3 months after the incident that shook public opinion, Orion Air, The airline, once engulfed in a massive boycott, did something few thought possible. It recovered. Not through PR spin, not through apologies, but through action. Bold, comprehensive, and a transformation that came from within. The numbers told the story. Passenger traffic rose by 19%. Customer satisfaction scores jumped 42%. An airline once branded as luxury discrimination in the skies was now honored by Aviation Equality magazine as the symbol of post-racial reform in the service industry. And at the center of that transformation was Ethan Cole, the man once removed from his own seat because he didn't look like someone who usually sits in 2A, was now being invited to take the guest of honor seat at global aviation conferences. But Ethan didn't stop at reclaiming justice for himself. He chose to change the system. Since Orion Air's turnaround, at least 8 international airlines have signed contracts with Veritas AI, the bias detection software Ethan founded, built specifically for customer service industries. Every line of code in that program was written with lived experience, with the tears and quiet resilience of a boy who grew up in the Bronx, who was once ignored, dismissed, and who had now become a symbol of equity. But it wasn't just software. Ethan personally led training sessions for major companies. How to detect subtle bias and disarm it from the first glance. Airlines, hotels, and banks began reaching out to Veritas. A ripple effect swept from boarding gates to customer service counters. People started calling it the 2A effect. Meanwhile, on the opposite end, Sophia Clarkson, the woman who bribed her way into Ethan's seat, faced a bitter reckoning. She was banned for life from flying with Orion Air. But it didn't stop there. The media company she worked for issued an internal statement. Contract terminated immediately, due to serious violations of ethical conduct and corporate reputation. Once a familiar face in business class, Sophia had become a symbol of entitled arrogance. The media no longer used her name, only referred to her as the 2A woman. And that was all anyone needed to understand. Ironically, in an interview, Ethan mentioned Sophia just once. I don't want anyone to lose their future, but if there's ever a moment in life when you must pay the price for your privilege, then this is that moment. And that moment opened a brand new path. Not just for Ethan, but for the entire global service industry. It only takes one person to stand up for the entire system through the main auditorium of Harvard University, where thousands of law and technology students sat attentively, watching the man walk up to the podium. Ethan Cole, CEO of Veritas AI, once dragged from his business class seat simply because of the color of his skin, was no longer just a symbol of technology. He had become a symbol of justice. Contrary to the fiery image some might have expected, Ethan began his talk with a smile. He didn't talk about lawsuits. He didn't condemn or attack. Instead, the screen behind him lit up with the very video captured by passenger Nora that day, from the moment Ethan was asked to give up his seat, to the quiet exchange of a white envelope, and finally, the image of Ethan calmly leaving the cabin, head held high, suitcase in hand, a portrait of unshakable dignity. This wasn't about personal offense, Ethan said, voice steady and composed. This was a test of how we respond to injustice when the system you helped build is the same one that turns on you. What will you do? The silence in the auditorium was thunderous. Ethan continued, I didn't need their apology. I needed their change. And they did change, not because of media pressure, but because of people like you, the generation sitting here who will refuse to repeat that mistake. After the talk, hundreds of students rose to their feet in a standing ovation. But the most powerful moment didn't come from the speech. It came from the young woman standing quietly at the side of the stage. Nora, the one who had pulled out her phone that day, not for fame, not for reward, but simply because she couldn't sit still and watch someone be treated unfairly. Ethan invited her on stage. I want you all to meet the person who changed this entire story with one small action, at just the right moment. Nora blushed, but her eyes were steady. I never thought the video would go this far, she said. I just thought, if I don't do something, then who will? Orion Air, the very airline that had once removed Ethan from his seat, had since hired Nora as head of ethical communications. Her role wasn't just crisis management. It was to redefine a new standard. No one should be invisible because of their skin color, gender, or background. A quiet act of kindness can cause a global shift. Ethan knew that better than anyone. He was once a kid in the Bronx learning to code on a used laptop who lost his father to a racially charged bullet. Now, he was witnessing a new generation, people like Nora, like the students in this auditorium, rise with intelligence, empathy, and action. The talk ended, but the story didn't. A tech student approached Ethan, eyes glowing with purpose. I want to work on fair AI, just like you did. Ethan smiled, his gaze full of hope. Good, because after me, it's your turn. Morning sunlight slanted through the glass windows of the 38th floor, where the strategic boardroom of Orion Air headquarters was located. On the large wall facing the conference table hung a framed photograph, Seat 2A. It wasn't luxurious or grand, just a simple empty seat with a small plaque underneath that read, "Never judge someone by the color of their skin," or "the seat they occupy." Across the table sat Ethan Cole, dressed in a black suit and navy blue tie, facing Cliff Bennett, CEO of Orion Air. But today, they were no longer two men on opposite ends of a scandal. They were partners, allies. Two people who had risen from a crisis and turned it into a rebirth for an entire industry. Cliff extended his hand. Ethan shook it. It wasn't a long or showy gesture, but it carried the weight of a journey from humiliation and resistance to reform and redemption. You turned a seat into a symbol, Cliff said quietly, and turned our shame into a chance to do what's right. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't show pride. He simply looked at the photograph of Seat 2A on the wall, his eyes deep and still, like the sea after a storm. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did that day, Ethan replied, his voice slow but resolute. We don't get to choose the skin we're born in, but we do get to choose how we treat one another. At that same moment, in the Orion Air auditorium, where employees were watching the live stream, a wave of applause broke out as Ethan's message was broadcast live. Through social media, millions of people shared the photo of Seat 2A. The story of Ethan Cole had become a global symbol of justice, intelligence, and resilience. Other airlines began adopting the Veritas AI standard, and soon, other service industries followed: banks, hotels, hospitals. Ethan's story was no longer just an isolated event. It had become a litmus test for the conscience of a generation. And then the closing line echoed, a blow to the bias still sleeping quietly in society's heart. They removed a black man from a plane, thinking he wasn't worthy of Seat 2A. What they didn't know was that he was the man who would decide whether they still deserved to sit in the CEO's seat. One refusal, one person who stood up at the right moment, and the whole world had to sit back down.